There are some days, some sugyas, when we learn in the koil, I wish I would be sitting in the koil here. And this is one of them. Because Ben Hashmoshes, it is, I think it's a shtickle pele, then in one of the most fundamental sugyas in Yiddishkeit is Mani Hayom V'Alayla. It affects so many different areas of Avodas Hashem, and there should be so much confusion. It's a philosophical question. How could this be? I mean, the routine, the daily routine of a Yid gets up in the morning, Kriya Shema, Tefillah, Mincha and Maariv, Shabbos Kodesh, Zman Hayom is everything. And there's so much different nuances and different opinions and different shittas. And even though I wrote quite a lot about the sugyas of Zman Hayom and Ben Hashmoshes, as some of you probably have seen in the Kultras, there is still so much that I still need clarity as well. So, Yoisem Amasha Ekro B'Fenechem Kosov Khan, and I really hope that Avrechem will go through what I wrote, the Minui V'Menaichi, this time Shmaitze. So even though I'm not that much in Koilel, I'm not much in my Koilel either, and I'm leaving to Chutz La'aretz this much of Shabbos, I do hope that maybe Ben Azmanim, I'll have a chavrusa with Bainish, and he will fill me in all the discussions and all the maskonas we had in Koilel. So the sugya of Ben Hashmoshes in Shabbos Lamed Daled Lamed Hey, that is fundamentally the source of the sugya, and we have Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, and Rabbi Yossi, three great Tanoim, and we have Machlokes Rabbi Rabbi Yosef Alibe de Rabbi Yehuda, and then we have Shmuel, who was an Amoira, and how does he dare to get into this fray? And while Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, and Rabbi Yossi speak about when is Ben Hashmoshes time-wise, Misha Tishka Chama, Ichsef Pnei Elyon, Ichsef Pnei Tachton, Hishvela Elyon, Chotzi Mel, Keheref Ayin. Shmuel comes along and he says, give him Keshavim. So one of the things that are Tzorachin in the Sugya, how does an Amoira come in when three great Tanoim have different opinions, and he seems to say something totally different? Has nothing to do with Misha Tishka Chama, or it's all about Gimel Koichavim. So, Rabbi Rav Yehuda, Rabbi Rav Yosef, Alibe de Rav Yehuda, and the Gemara says it depends, Treitil Semel or Gimel Revei Mel. So there's a slight nafkamina between Rabbi and Rav Yosef, Alibe de Rav Yehuda. How long is Ben Hashmoshes? But the big discussion in the Rishonim is, okay, so we have Gimel Revei Mel, but where did those Gimel Revei Mel start? From when? When do we put those Gimel Revei Mil? How much is Gimel Revei Mil? And there's also a discussion. Is it 18 minutes, 22 and a half minutes, 24 minutes? Different opinions. The Shulchan Aruch says 18 minutes, and the Shulchan Aruch appears not in Hilchos Shabbos, but rather in two different sources in Toras Hashem. On one hand, in Hilchos Pesach, and Hilchos Malicha, Yodei Samech Tes, and Orach Chaim Tov Nun Tes. How long is a mil? So Gimel Revei Mil. And what I'm saying is, you've been through this 100 times, but L'Te'eles Advorim, just to have the proper Seder, three different opinions in the Rishonim. Rabbeinu Tam, Gaonim, and Yereim. And Shittas HaGaonim is also somewhat of such a Gavaldig Chiddush, because none of the Rishonim bring a different opinion than Rabbeinu Tam. And Tzais says 5 different sources in Shas, and the Ramban, and the Rashba, and the Ran. All we have is Shittas Rabbeinu Tam. Till Maram al-Shakar comes along, 300 years later, in Chuvas Maram Shikar Tzadik Vav, who was Maram Shikar. He was a Chover Beis Din Oishar Baz. And that is about 300 years, or 400 years even after the early Rishonim. And he is the first one that says, wait a minute, there's something new in the sugi. I have Aksav Yad, the Goinim, and he quotes Rav Hai Goin, Rav Nissim Goin, and Rav Sadia Goin, the three greatest Goinim that were way before Rabbeinu Tam, and they have a different opinion. So what's Rabbeinu Tam and what is the Goinim? Everything starts with a stira between two sugyas. When Shabbos Lamed we learn Gimel River Mil, after the Shkia is night. But Psuchim, it is Daled Mil after the Shkia that is night. And how do we reconcile the two sugyas? So Rabbeinu Tam says there's Tchila Shkia v'Soif Shkia. Tchila Shkia is Daled Mil before nightfall. Soif Shkia is Gimel River Mil. So according to Rabbeinu Tam, is there any relevance in Tchilas Shkia that we learn in Psochim Tzadik Daled L'choyre not? The Gaonim say no. Mishetishka Hachama, that is when we start counting Gimel Rivei Mil, and 13 and a half minutes later is Lailo, because if a Mil is 18 minutes, then Gimel Rivei Mil would be 13 and a half minutes, and that is night. So fundamentally, Gimel Revi Mil is a more important number because that's in the Sugya Ben Ishmos Shabbos Lamed Hey. The Sugya in Psochim Tzadik Daled is not a Halachic Sugya, but rather Chazal just talk about astronomy in that Sugya. So according to Rabbeinu Tam, the first Shkia doesn't bear that much relevance. It is only the fact that that is Tchilas Shkia. But the Sof Shkia, that is 13 and a half minutes before Tzais HaKoychovim. The Goyim say no. Mishetishkechame kipshutoi. When you no longer see the fireball, you no longer see the sun, that is when you start counting. 13 and a half minutes later is night. Yereim, Mitzvah Kov Beis, is a different sugya, and almost none of the Rishonim HaPoiskim Paskan the Yereim. The Bach says lechatchila one should be machmir choishish to the Yereim, and he says the Shkia is actually nightfall, and the 13 and a half minutes is the last 13 and a half minutes before the Shkia. So the main discussion is between Rabbeinu Tam and the Goinim. Maram al-Shikar obviously felt it's a bit strange that none of the Rishonim bring this Shlit'a, and I will go 500 years later and start quoting the Goinim. So Maram al-Shikar argues, Rashi, Rif, Rambam, if they say Mishatish Kachamo, Be'echrech, that is Shittas HaGoinim. Because if we're talking about Sof Shkia, then they need to say that. And Stimas Erif and Stimas Rambam would have the greatest. And the early Rishonim, Be'echrech, their opinion is in accordance to the Goinim. Maram al-Shikar also has another argument, which is fascinating. Fascinating B'darkei Talmud. So Maram al-Shikar says, the Rabbeinu Tam and the Goinim actually go all the way back to the machlokes between Yisrael and Chachmi Yisrael. Where does the sun go by night? And that is a question probably in children's books would be asked in this fashion. What does the sun do by night? Where does he go to sleep? Where does the sun go by night? And in Psochim Tzadik Daled, there's a machlokes, two fascinating opinions. In modern science, both of them would be a bit out of touch. So Chachmi Yisrael said, by day, the sun goes memizrach lemarev, memizrach shemesh ad marev. And when it reaches the edge of the south, of the west, tzad marev, then it penetrates oivi harokia. And that is the Daled Mil. It takes the sun Daled Mil to go from one side of the top of the world, the cover of the world, like a kedera with a round cover, and it takes Daled Mil for the sun to go from the inner side of the rakia to the outer side of the rakia, and then by night it makes its journey back from west to east. And in the morning, once again, from the Lois Shachar ad Neitzachamo, it penetrates that same rakia from the outer side to the inner side, and then it makes its journey once again from east to west. That is Chachmi Yisrael. Chachma Umas Oilam said no. It goes from east to west. By night it goes in the bottom of the world, and it goes around the world. But obviously, Chachma Umas Oilam thought that the world is flat. And one of the rayas that they brought to prove their Shita is, in the morning, Mayona is Chamim, and by night, Mayona is Karen. So why are the wells warmer in the morning than by night? Because the sun is on the bottom side of the world, and the rays of the sun, the heat of the sun, warms up the waters, and that is why in the morning, the waters are hot. So says the Maramal Shkia, Rabbeinu Tam is based on the opinion of Chachmi Yisrael. And that is what Rabbeinu Tam clearly says in Tzais. When it starts to go through Oivi Harukia, you still see the sun. Still gives a lot of light. And that is Tchilas Shkia, which is not relevant. It takes a Daled Mil till it gets to the outer side of the Rakia, and it starts making its way up from west to east. And that is Tzais HaKechovim, and Gimel River Mil. Before Tzais HaKechovim, that is Tchilas Alayla, that is Bein HaShmoshois. Shita Segaoinim fits in better with Umas Oilam. Why? Because when the sun goes from east to west and it dips down the bottom of the world, that is the Shkia, and it takes a Gimel River Mil till it starts to make its way back from west to east. So when it goes to east to west, the earth obviously has some thickness. So just going through that thickness before it starts making its way back, that is the Gimel Rive Mil from the Shkia to Tzais HaKechovim. Because only when the sun goes under the earth, you no longer see its light. But as long as the sun is on the side of the earth, you still see its light. And because the Rambam in Moy Nevuchim Perik Beis Ches writes that Chachmum Esarim are right, L'shitosai, that's Shita Segaoinim. This is a very interesting argument. That the Machlokes, Rabbeinu Tam, and the Gainim necessarily depend on scientific discrepancy and argument between the Chachmas and Chachmas. And because the Rambam in Moy Nevuchim says the Umas Oilam are right, and that is why, Bechreach, Shitosai Kagaoinim. One might argue, let's not mix the Moy Nevuchim into the Sugya of Bein HaShmoshes. There's the Rambam in the Moy Nevuchim is one thing, the Rambam in Mishlei is another thing. And it's interesting, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Rishon in Tzais in Shabbos Daf Lamed Daled has a totally different explanation for Rabbeinu Tam, and according to the Tzais, it has nothing to do with the Sugya Psuchim Tzadik Daled. Maybe at another opportunity we will try to understand how really we deal with this Machlokes Chachmi Yisrael and Chachmum Oilam. And many times I say, when people thousands of years ago tried to understand what is day and what is night, and before they had tools, astronomical tools, I think both opinions were a spark of genius. If all you have is your eyes and your mind and nothing else, I think both opinions are fascinating, because they ask themselves, where's the sun by night? Well, what does he do? Where is he? Where is he hiding away? So, what is accepted today is starkly different than both Chachmum Yisrael and both Chachmi Yisrael. But that is a different discussion, because I really don't think this has anything to do with Bein HaShmoshes. Sugya Bein HaShmoshes is Sugya and Halacha, and maybe at some other time we will discuss a really fundamental ashkofedika halachadika shaila of science and halacha. And I have a very clear opinion that science and halacha don't go together. They were never meant to go together. They can't go together because they are totally different in nature. And The Shitosi, there are no status at all between science and halacha because they never were meant to go hand in hand. Never. So, Toysa Shlit'a says, what's Shittas Rabbeinu Tam? Shkia Mishurit and the Shkia Meroshe HaHorim. So the Shkia Mishurit starts early, but the real Shkia is the Shkia Meroshe HaHorim, and the difference between the two is Daled Mil, or Daled Mil minus 13 and a half minutes, minus Gimel Rivei Mil. So Ben Hashmoshe starts by the Shkia Shnia, or Soif Shkia, and that is the Shkia Meroshe HaHorim. So according to what I said, it has nothing to do with Psochim Tzadik Daled, with the Machlokes where the sun goes by night, and therefore Lav Ha Talia, and even if the Rambam says Chachma Umas Oilam are right, it doesn't affect at all whether the Gaonim or Rabbeinu Tam are right in the Sugya of Ben Hashmoshes. So once again, Shittas Eyareim, Shitta Mechudeshes, and it is unique, and it's a Das Yochid. And the Bach says, Lechatchila one should be Machmer, but that's not what all the other poskim say. And the big controversy is between Rabbeinu Tam and the Gaonim. And the Chiddush is, Rabbeinu Tam is all the other Rishonim. Rabbeinu Tam is Toysus many places in Shas, and the Ramban and the Rashba and the Ran, and practically all the Rishonim, till Maram al-Shakar, was hundreds of years later, and he brings a Ksav Yad, and his argument is, Stimas Arei Rambam proves Shittas Goyim, which the Meches Kohen also disputes. They say Meshittas Kachame, just like Rabbeinu Tam speaks about the Shkia and its Soif Shkia, maybe the same derif in the Rambam, especially that we don't find the Rambam doesn't quote the Messiahs of the Goyim. So the Chiddush is, the Birkei Yosef writes, Minag Eretz Yisrael K'Shittas HaGaonim, and he writes that both in Birkei Yosef and both in Machzor Bracha, which is a Chiddush because usually the Beis Yosef is more the Aradi Yisrael, and in almost all other halachas, because the Beis Yosef is Minag Eretz Yisrael, but the Chidah writes no, Minag Eretz Yisrael. The Chidah was 200 years younger than the Beis Yosef, more than 200 years, but he writes Minag Eretz Yisrael is K'Shittas HaGaonim, Velo K'Shittas HaGaonim. So Lecha Oira, Tzais HaKechovim is not relevant at all to Shittas HaGaonim, or rather, Soif Daled Mil is not relevant to Shittas HaGaonim, and Tchilas Daled Mil is not relevant to Shittas HaBeiru Tam. Maybe it shouldn't be such a Gevaldige Pelle, because once again, the Sugya in Psochim is not a Halachic Sugya. It is a Sugya in which Chazal deal with astronomy. Where does the sun go by night? How long does it take? The more relevant Sugya is the one of Masechet Shabbos, which is Trei Tilsa Mil, L'Shittas Rabbi Yosef, O Gimel Rivei Mil, L'Shittas Rambam. But there are several halachas in which, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, Tchilas HaShkia is Kodeya. And one is Kodshim, Psil Dam, Zikas Adam, and that is Shkia Rishona, even according to Rabbeinu Tam. So in Zvochem Daf Nun Vav, Dam is Nifsal, B'Shkia Sachamo, B'Yoyim HaKrivoi Ezivcha Ochel, B'Yoyim Shetu Zoveach, Atu Makrev. And you cannot do Zikas Domim after the Shkia. And Rabbeinu Tam says, this halacha is Tchilas HaShkia and not Sof Shkia, unlike Zmanei Hayoim v'Halayla. And Briskerov in stencil says, it's not only a din that you can't be Zerek Adam, a din in Avodas HaKorban, that Avodas HaKorban is Posaliach HaShkia, it's a Psul in the Dam. But it is not like Psulina or Psul Tuma or other Psulim that pasal a Korban. It is somewhere in the middle. It's not only a din in Gavra, She'i Efshar Lizrek Esadom La'achar HaShkia, the Dam is Nifsala. However, it's not Psulina. Psulina is only Be'alois HaShachar, but it is a Psul in the Chefza of the Dam. So the Briskerov writes that someone asked Reb Chaim HaGavaldige Kasha. The Rambam Perek Aleph Halacha Ches Me'echus Chometz U'Matzah writes, Ha'oichel min ha'chometz m'shei shuas v'lamala erev Pesach lo yikam. Mepi ha'shmua lamadnu לא יאכל עולב חומץ, what's the lesson of the posuk? לא יאכל עולב חומץ, מזמן שחיתת הפסח, and Issa of Achilas Chometz. So the Ikalav is Bizman Achilas HaPesach, Mishpia Lamadnu, Piash Mor Lamadu, that Mishchasois HaYoim, which is the Zman of Shchitas HaPesach, Li'ach Shchitas HaTomed, there's an Issa of Achilas Chometz. So someone asked Reb Chaim, Men Shkia Tzais HaKechom, there should be no Malchus, or Echal Chometz B'Erev Pesach. Because there's B'Shuv Shatu Zove'eches HaPesach, is also B'Achilas Chometz. But you can't do Shchitas HaPesach and Zrikas HaDomim from the Shkia at Tzais HaKechovim. So in that Zman, there should be no lav, which would be a Gavaldig Chiddush. Because the Achat Tzais HaKechovim, V'adei Shelo Yikor Chometz, it's in Issa Koros. At Tzais HaKechovim is Manasiyas HaPesach. But from the Shkia to Tzais HaKechovim, there would be no lav, and that would be a Gavaldig Chiddush. So Reb Chaim said no. Even though there's a psil Zrikas Adam, the dam is nifsal, but it is still zman hara'ui l'shchitas HaPesach. Because it's not like psilina. The korban is not a korban posel, but the dam is posel azrik. So it's a shtickle chiddush. But that is one halacha in which Rabbeinu Tam agrees that Shkia Rishoyna, Tchilas HaShkia is kaveh, and that is the psul of Zrikas Domim in Kodesh. In other area, Talmid Rabbeinu Yoina, in Brochas Chavav, Tfilas HaMincha. Because Tfilas HaMincha is totally the Tomid. And therefore the Tomid is Ada Shkia Rishoyna, Kamo B'Kodshim. And therefore, Zman Tfilas HaMincha Lechatchila is Shkia Rishoyna. And the Bialoch and Shatzian, the Shemishach and Shatzian brings, in Reish Lamed Gimel brings this opinion, but it's not Das Shulchan Aruch. And according to Shulchan Aruch, Ad Tzais HaKechovim you could have in Mincha, and the Mishnah Brura writes more than once, Lechatchila tzarich litpalel Mincha lefnei Shkia, even though Pashtas Das Shulchan Aruch you could have in Mincha Ad Tzais HaKechovim. Tosefes Shabbos, Reish Samech Aleph. Because the Shulchan Aruch and Reish Samech Aleph paskins in accordance to Rabbeinu Tam. But the Zman of the Sefer Shabbos is Mishet Tishkacham and Mishkia Rishoyna. So these are a few halachas in which there is some relevance, Tchilas HaShkia, L'Shitas Rabbeinu Tam. But Rabbeinu Tam maintains that Shkia Sachama, as we define Shkia Sachama, which is when the sun is no longer visible and the Ofek, is not really relevant, only in a very limited number of halachas, as we explained. And Shkia Sachama lahalacha is Soif Shkia. Some Rishonim speak about Shkia Rishoyna, Shkia Shnia. Others speak about Tchilas HaShkia and Soif Shkia. L'cha'oira, Hainu Hach. So the big difficulty with Rabbeinu Tam and the Gohanim as well, how does it fit in with the Metzias and Eretz Yisrael? And how does the time of Gimel Rivei Mel fit in with Shmuel that says Gimel Kechovim Beinoim? So in Siman Reish Tzaddik Gimel, when we deal with Mitzvah Shabbos and not Knesses Shabbos, could I have a Mishnah Brura? So Reish Samach Aleph and Reish Tzaddik Gimel are the two relevant simonim. Reish Samach Aleph deals with Knesses Shabbos, Manad Lukas Haneres, and Reish Tzaddik Gimel deals with Yetzias Shabbos. So Reish Samach Aleph, Safek Chashecha Ben Hashmoshois, Ein Miasnas and Mai, Ein Madvinas HaKelim, Ein Madliken Es HaNerois, Hainu Kedei Shehilach Shloishes Levamelach HaShkia Sachama, Shemel Shlisho Pocha Shnei Chalakim, and that is 18 minutes is the Shia Mil. So, here we learn that Ben Hashmosha starts B'Shkia Sachama. Yesh oimrim shetzorach lo'isef machal HaKodesh. It It's Yesh Omer because the Rambam, Ki Yadua, doesn't bring the din of the Sefer Shabbos. Yesh Omer shetzorach Weiss Mechal HaKodesh, Zman Tesef Zeh, Metchilas HaShkia, Shein Hashem Shnei Ha'Oretz, Ad Zman Bein HaShemoshoi. So that is the Zman, Tchilas HaShkia, is the Zman of the Sefer Shabbos. Reish Tzaddik Gimel, Ma'ach L'Tchilas HaShabbos Kedei Weiss Mechal HaKodesh. Tzorach L'Zor Ma'as Malocha, Ad Sheir Shlosh Kechov Miktanim. V'lo Mefezon Ele Ritzufim. Why Ketanim? Because we are not Boki B'Koichovim. So B'Mektzoi Shabbos doesn't speak about Gimel Revei Mil, he doesn't mention the Shkia, only Gimel Kechovim. And the Bialocha grapples with the question of Simer Reish Tzaddik Gimel, and he brings two drachim. Reish Tzaddik Gimel maybe is a person that doesn't know what time it is. We need to understand, 2,000 years ago, people didn't have watches. Zamanei Hayoim, they had sun watches, following the sun. So, Reish Tzaddik Gimel speaks with people that don't have watches. But still, Reish Samachalav, he speaks about Gimel Revei Mil, the Hainu, after the Shkia. So why doesn't he speak in Motzei Shabbos the same? After the Shkia, how long do you need to wait? Gimel Revei Mil, or Daled Mil, or Kol Echad L'Shitosoi? Motzei Shabbos, all we talk about is Kechovim. And that is the shit of Shmuel, after we have three Tanoim, and Rabbi Rabbi Yosef Ali Rabbi Yehuda, and Shmuel comes along and he speaks about Kechovim. So the first Mahalach in Bialocha is, if a person knows what time it is, then he does not rely on Kechovim, not even Kechovim Tanim, he needs to wait 72 minutes. Daled Mil, L'Shita Sabeno Tam. And then the Mishnah Berurah says, and the second Mahalach of the Mishnah Berurah is the Minchas Kohen, and then he says, no. If you see Gimel Kechovim Miktanim, that overrides the Shir of 72 minutes of Daled Revei Mil. And I think it is based on Pashtus Losho in Chazal throughout Shas, Tzais Kechovim, which is based on a Posek in Nehemiah, V'anachnu oisem b'malocha v'machzikim b'ramocha mi'aloisa shachar ad Tzais Kechovim. Tzais Kechovim is night. So how do we define Daled Mil? So one must say Daled Mil if you don't see Kechovim. And sometimes it's a rainy day and you don't see Kechovim, and then you need to be Choshesh Daled Mil. And maybe Daled Mil is the maximum. As we know today, different places of the world, there will be more light or less light between Shkia Sachamu and Tzais Kechovim, so maybe Daled Mil is the maximum. More than Daled Mil, we never need to be Choshesh, but it could be less than Daled Mil.
Rabbeinu Tam is answering the Gemaras, which is L'chara talking about Eretz Yisrael, or Bavel, the Ifik of Bavel or Eretz Yisrael.
So in my tshuva, I brought various poskim throughout the ages that tried to deal with this question, and some said that Rabbeinu Tam lived in France, and I don't have a clear answer to the question, but the Tanoim were in Eretz Yisrael. And these are Divrei Tanoim. And so Rabbeinu Tam is dealing with Eretz Yisrael. Unless we say, and I don't know whether we are allowed to say that Rabbeinu Tam living in France wasn't an astronomer. He wasn't aware that in different places in the world, Tzais Kechovim would be earlier or later. And it's, I'm trying to be very cautious with what I say. So the Kloisenberg Rebbe was the big fighter for Shittas Rabbeinu Tam in our generation, and in Divrei Yatzav there are several shuvas, and he asked one of his talmidim, who was a friend of mine in yeshiva, to put together all the sources you could find for Shittas Rabbeinu Tam, and he wrote a Kuntas Rabbeinu. How many sources did he find? More than 100.
180.
What?
180 or something.
180?
Yeah, something like
I think wherever he saw the two words Rabbeinu Tam, he put it into his Kuntas. So the Kloisenberg Rebbe was extremely angry at anybody that would bring up such a thought, and he said it's apikorsis, chas v'sholem, and l'chayra, he is right. How could we say Rabbeinu Tam is talking in Tzarfat? Rabbeinu Tam knew, should have known, and he's dealing with Eretz Yisrael. And if Rabbeinu Tam is Kodesh Kodeshim, and that is the Halacha, and all the Poiskim, Shulchan Aruch Paskins Rabbeinu Tam, and it must be relevant in Eretz Yisrael. but how does it fit in? So I wrote 2 mahalchim in my tshuva, and I think both mahalchim have earlier sources, but that is what it seemed to me. And I think when most of the paskin Rabbeinu Tam, it is not necessarily 72 minutes of Rabbeinu Tam. It's not necessarily the shir of Daled Mil. They paskin in accordance to the Rabbeinu Tam by the fundamental machlokes between Gaonim and Rabbeinu Tam are those Gimel Rivei Mil, right after the Shkia or before Tzais, because that is the fundamental machlokes. As much time as there is between the Shkia and Neres La'ayin and Tzais, where do we put the Gimel Rivei Mil? Does the Gimel Rivei Mil start after Shkia, or the Gimel Rivei Mil start before Tzais? And the time between Shkia and Tzais is a maximum 72 minutes, could be 50 minutes, could be 40 minutes, it depends where in the world. But how long that time period is, there's a machlokes Rabbeinu Tam and Gaon. And the machlokes is, Gimel Rivei Mil start Shkia, and Memela, after 13.5 minutes is night, or Gimel Rivei Mil are the last Gimel Rivei Mil before it says Yichovim, whenever that would be. And I was medayek most of the Shoinim, when they bring Rabbeinu Tam, they write Gimel Rivei Mil lifnei Tzais Yichovim. And the Dogesh is not on Daled Mil. So I think Daled Mil is the less important number, because Daled Mil, once again, is not a member of the Halacha, and Daled Mil might be maximum Daled Mil. I don't know. And there are different opinions what is a mil. So when all the Rishonim follow Rabbeinu Tam, it is not necessarily 72 minutes of Rabbeinu Tam. It is the more fundamental machlokes disagreement between Gaonim and Rabbeinu Tam, which is those Gimel Rivei Mil, those 13.5 minutes, are they the last before Tzais Yichovim or the first after Shkia? And there always would be a big nafka min el halacha.
The way the Rav is saying it, does there have to be a machlokes in the Haggadah of Tzais Yichovim is?
No.
So then, if you work backwards, they'll have the same Tzais. The Gaonim and Rabbeinu Tam can have the same Tzais Yichovim?
Tzais would be the same. Yeah, that is what I argue. The Bein HaShmoshes would be different.
It'll end up being
And that, to me it makes so much sense. The Tzais is Gimel Kechavim.
Both of them are Tzais though.
And that is why in Shulchan Aruch we don't have any confusion with the Tzais. Gimel Kechavim time is Tzais.
What happened between Bein HaShmoshes and Tzais to the Gaonim?
What?
What happened between Bein HaShmoshes and Tzais to the Gaonim?
Oh, according to the Gaonim, we would need to assume that those Kechavim we see after 13.5 minutes are Kechavim Beinonim. So maybe I didn't understand your question. The Halachic Tzais, definitely there would be a difference between Gaonim and Rabbeinu Tam, because after all the machlokes says, when do you do a malacha Motzei Shabbos? But not in the concept of Tzais HaKechavim, which means Daled Mil is not the important number. So the question is, do we start counting those Gimel Rivei Mil by the Shkia, and then we need to assume 13.5 minutes later is night, and whatever Kechavim we see would be Kechavim Beinonim, or we say no. Rias Kechavim, and that is Kechavim Tanim, and it's from there that you go backwards, Gimel Rivei Mil.
Even if this.
So I want to solve 2 problems. One problem is Kechavim. And that is the problem which concerns me less L'Shit'as HaGoyim and more L'Shit'as Rabbeinu Tam, because we need to be miyashiv Reish HaMachalef and Reish HaDegimel. So Reish HaMachalef paskins Rabbeinu Tam, so how come in Reish HaDegimel we don't find Rabbeinu Tam? You look at the sky. And Ha'emes Yoredarko, the first derech of the Bialoch is a Gavaldik Gedoichik. That Reish HaDegimel is if you don't know what time it is. So in Reish HaMachalef you did know what time it is, until Reish HaDegimel you forgot what time it is, or your watch stopped working in the middle of Shabbos and you couldn't wind it up. So doesn't make sense. And the second question is, Shmuel says, It's all about Tzais HaKechavim. So what I mean to say is 72 minutes is not the essence of Shittas Rabbeinu Tam. The essence of Shittas Rabbeinu Tam is that Bein HaShmoshes Gimel Reva Mil are the Gimel Reva Mil before Tzais HaKechavim, and the Shkia is not relevant. But Gimel Reva Mil before Tzais HaKechavim. The Goinim say no. All you need to look at is the Shkia, and Gimel Reva Mil after the Shkia, that is night.
But the Achrech for Rabbeinu Tam still came from the fact of 72 minutes, Daled Mil, because that was the whole Achrech of where to place
Yeah.
it. So we're not
But we will be flexible with the Daled Mil, and we would say Daled Mil is a maximum Shir. Or maybe Daled Mil Lav Dafka, I don't know. But I want to be Miyash of the Shulchan Aruch and also the Metzias.
Would be a
Because
vanity day, no?
one of the huge difficulties is in Eretz Yisrael, and many times they say the Sugya of Bein HaShmoshes doesn't start with Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda and Shabbos Lamed Aleph. It starts in Parshas Bereishis. Vayikro Elokim la'or yoim u'lechoshech korov lailo. Could you ignore that pasuk? Vayikro Elokim la'or yoim u'lechoshech korov lailo. So we have a huge problem in Eretz Yisrael, both with the Rabbeinu Tam and the Goyim, because 13 and a half minutes after the Shkia, it's still daylight. And you don't see any Kechovim usually. Any Kechovim. 50 minutes or 40 minutes after the Shkia, it's pitch black, and you see 1,000 Kechovim. So how do we deal? And I want to focus on Rabbeinu Tam, because Shulchan Aruch Paskins Rabbeinu Tam. So how does Rabbeinu Tam, how will he deal with it? And this is a question that troubled Poskim. The Kloiser Rebbe wasn't troubled. And he said, we don't know what light is, we don't know what black is. We don't know what, neither what's light, neither what's dark. We only know Halacha. 72 minutes. For 72 minutes, it's light. Looks dark, but it's really light. It's not dark.
So who had in, the mushroom we checked in northern England, in Manchester in the summer, 72 minutes after Shkia is quite light. And to wait for the real dark, you have to wait 2 hours. So we sort of said, take out Shabbat 72 minutes, I don't care how light or dark. There's no sun in the sky, but it's quite light. It's the same light as, let's say, 28 minutes in Yerushalayim.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Psak. Even
72.
What?
72?
Yeah, because we don't ever find more than 72 minutes. However, the more north you go, so in northern Norwegia,
No sunset, that's a
there is no Tzais HaKechavim B'chlal summer.
But in Norway, there's 72 minutes after sunset, there's sunrise, like before that.
That's the Arctic Circle, but in England, in Manchester, 72 minutes after is the equivalent of 25 minutes.
So why would there be a difference between northern Norwegia or Manchester? Just because in Manchester more Jews live?
It's higher. No, it's higher. I mean, the point is, there is
I know it's higher, but halachically, from halachic perspective.
No, I mean, in Manchester, if you wait another hour, it will actually be in July. It'll be quite dark. There'll be stars in the sky. But at 72, there won't be. It'll be like.
I think there is room to argue that because very high up north, in early days, people couldn't live, or very few lived, very few Jews lived, and it was Mochutz liyishuv, rochek min hayishuv. So maybe the definitions of Gimel Kechavim were said b'mukim hayishuv, b'mukim yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and very high up north, where people didn't live, maybe there the halacha definitely wouldn't be go look for stars, because you won't find any. So night cannot be Kechavim. But one of my fundamental arguments is, wherever you are in the world, a day is a cycle of 24 hours. There is no such a thing a day that is 120 hours or 10,000 hours. It's starting at the beginning of the summer and ending at the end of the summer. A day is always as we learn on Parshas Bereshis. A 24-hour cycle is a day. The darkest part of that cycle would be defined as night. Lagabi Kriya Shema Shel Harvest, Lagabi Yetzias Shabbos. So it is relative.
Mashal of the North
But
Pole.
in those places where there is Tzais HaKerchovim, the question would be, do we need to wait for Tzais HaKerchovim, or we would say, the maximum Shir is 72 minutes, and that is Daled Mil. More than Daled Mil, you never have to wait. And that is what Rav Padev Paskin.
The Rav
We
is
don't
saying
find more than Daled, what?
I'm saying to feed the Rav that fundamentally 72 is the less important Chelik of Rabbeinu Tam.
No.
You have to choose.
We're dealing with, no,
We have to decide.
I'm trying to explain. I don't mean to say we totally laugh away 72 minutes. I say Daled Mil is the maximum. But Tzais HaKerchovim could be before Daled Mil. Daled Mil is the maximum. More than Daled Mil, you never have to wait, and that is 72 minutes.
The Gemara dealing
But
with
it could be earlier. And if you see Gimel Kerchovim, then Nightfall is earlier than Daled Mil.
the Gemara.
But there's room to argue, but there's never more than Daled Mil, because that is what we learn in after the Shkia, it's Daled Mil.
The Gemara of Daled Mil is talking about Erev Pesach. So that would be roughly corresponding to what's called the equinox day, where it's half-half. Wouldn't therefore the summer be even longer than Daled Mil?
Right, if it can be shorter, why
If it could be shorter, why can't it be longer? If it's the middle, so it could be longer.
Maybe.
Hagufa, why pick Daled Mil?
So what?
Maybe Hagufa, why pick their pace of Daled Mil?
So this would be the dissenting opinion that in Manchester you need to wait longer. How much longer would it take to say Kerchovim?
It depends which Tzais HaKerchovim. If you want astronomically, if you want the darkness that you have 72 in Eretz Yisrael, if we're waiting for that 72, so then in Manchester in June you have to wait till 11:39.
By Gimel Kerchovim?
Which
No.
Gimel Kerchovim? The first Gimel Kerchovim, there's different shiurim. Depends which Gimel
If
Kerchovim.
the goal is to
It's
match,
certainly more
meaning
than
if the goal is to match the picture in the sky that I see in Eretz Yisrael, whatever, roughly, the picture in the sky that I see in Eretz Yisrael, Yud Daled Nisan,
That's it.
in June in Manchester, you might never have it. But it might be 2 or 3 hours.
The question is our interpretation in the Gemara Sochem Dafka Erev Pesach, or the Chazal mean to say a broader statement that Daled Mil is this man.
If we would accept this argument that we have to assume the most only to the Banisa, that even in Eretz Yisrael, in summer months, we have to wait longer than 72 minutes.
No, never need to wait.
Right. So I'm saying, meaning if we would
That's what he
accept that in
said.
No, but-
Manchester, that we would have to wait longer.
If you work
Even
with-
in Eretz Yisrael, we would have to wait longer on Sundays.
Why is
Because
that?
we're always talking about Dafka Nisa.
If it was talking about Nisan, so then in the summer it would be longer, and in the winter it would be less.
Oh no, and that is why I say when you see Gimel Kerchovim, that is night.
But
That
the-
is night, and in Eretz Yisrael you always see Gimel Kerchovim
But-
before 72
But the
minutes.
Gimel Kochavim that I see in Nisan 72 minutes later,
Why do you need this?
I see
They don't need to be
90
the same Gimel
Gimel
Kerchovim. They don't need to be the same Gimel
Why you guys are
Kerchovim.
back to the
But when you see Gimel Kerchovim Beinonim, then that's it.
so. But how could it get? Kashem that it can't get bigger. How could it get less?
What?
If it can't, if the sheer 72 minutes can't get bigger, meaning I'm looking at the sky and I see those are the stars,
It can never
and it
get
can't get
bigger,
bigger.
but it
So
could
why
get
can't it get less? Meaning the less the stars I'll see are much smaller.
But there's still Kerchovim
Is there
Beinonim.
machlokes-
There's a big range of Kerchovim Beinonim.
I don't even know.
It is never more than 72 minutes. It actually is always less. It could be 25, it could be 30, it could be 35, but it'll always be less than 72
I don't know
minutes.
if we go by Chametz 18 minutes if maybe Daled Mil is really...
What?
If we don't really have the right Daled Mil, so by Chametz we could make it up to a whole 18 minutes.
No, but we do know what a mil is. We do. I say Daled Mil is not necessarily always Daled Mil. Daled Mil is the maximum.
But
So, but let's get back to our
how
point.
does this?
So on one hand, Shmuel says Gimel Kerchovim, and that's the Psachel Shechanoch Eleish Savi Gimel. Eleish Samachalef, it is about Gimel Revei Mil. So one could say Eleish Samachalef we are Machmir, because Shabbos we're Machmir, but we definitely should be Machmir on Tzur Shabbos. Gimel Kerchovim is the more defining factor, and when most of the poskim paskin Rabbeinu Tam, it is not necessarily the Daled Mil of Rabbeinu Tam. It is whenever you determine Tzais HaKerchovim, Ben Ishmosh starts 13 and a half minutes earlier. So that is now. I also wrote a different Mahalach, which would be a Gavaldige Chiddush. It would be a Chiddush because it goes against what all the poskim actually spoke about in Shittas Rabbeinu Tam. And my other argument that I wanted to say is that according to Rabbeinu Tam, the Daled Mil does not start from what we call today Shkia Sachamo, in which the sun actually dips below the horizon. That is how we define Shkia. And I was medayek primarily the Lashon of the Ran, and I think we find similar Rishonos in other sources as well. So the Ran says, Shabbos Tezvav Amid Aleph and a new Medav Beis Amid Beis. Kishe'ein Hashemesh neres oid al ha'oretz ze hashkia. Shemesh nera al ha'oretz. So, how does the Areim define Shkia? And he says, Ben Ishmosh starts before the Shkia. So the Lashon of the Areim is, when it looks like the Shemesh plans to go to sleep. When it looks like the Shemesh is planning to go beyond the horizon. And according to the Areim, the Shkia is not the actual Shkia when you no longer see the sun, but when the sun comes close to being Shkia. And in Ramat we have a beautiful Shkia. And you see the sun slowly going under, and before the sun goes under the horizon, from Ramat it's like a fireball. The entire sky is red. So the Ran, quoting Rabbeinu Tam, Kishe'ein Hashemesh nera oid al ha'oretz, and I have a Lashon in my tshuva, and I don't know this moment whether it's the Lashon of the Ran or the Lashon of the Minchas Osher. But what I wrote is, maybe Shemesh nera al ha'oretz means above the oretz. And before the Shemesh goes under, it's litzad ha'oretz and not al ha'oretz. It doesn't look as if it is on top, but rather totally on the side, as if it approached its place and then it just goes down vertically. And that is when the Daled Mil starts. And that would also solve the problem in Eretz Yisrael. So maybe in the definition of Shkia, Rabbeinu Tam is like the Areim. He would not agree with the Areim. Where do you put those 13 and a half minutes? But how does he define Shkia if we take the Areim and put it into Rabbeinu Tam's mouth? That would also solve the dilemma of the 72 minutes on Gimel Kerchovim. So the Areim says the Shkia is not when you no longer see the sun, but rather when the sun is approaching, bedtime has arrived, and the son is putting on his pajamas, getting ready to go to sleep. That is the Shkia of the Areim, and maybe that's the Shkia of Rabbeinu Tam, and that is when the Daled Mil starts.
You only gained though, after 13 and a half minutes. It's still
Not
fair.
Not true, you gain more.
Rabbeinu Tam is
No, you gain more than 13 and a half minutes. 13 and a half minutes is the magic number of Gimel River Mil to which the Areim is bound. But the stage of Shkia could be more than 13, it could be much more. And that would solve our dilemma, how do we deal with 72 minutes?
Where's the Rav keep? Where's the Rav keep, Sachako?
Then Rabbeinu Tam could agree to the
I'm a Kloisenberger Chassid.
How did Rabbeinu Tam call that Uri Harakia?
I keep Rabbeinu Tam. Many times I told an amusing story about the Kloisenberger Rebbe. So the Kloisenberger Rebbe built Kiryat Sanz and Netanya, and those were all sons of Hasidim. And then his people built Kiryat Sanz in Yerushalayim, and that, to the ones that initiated Kiryat Sanz Yerushalayim, it was a business. And there were no Kloisenberger Hasidim there. And when the Kloisenberger Rebbe heard that in Kiryat Sanz people eat nishimatzes and they daven before Rabbeinu Tam, he was petrified, he was horrified. And he said, how could I do this on the name of the Divrei Chaim, on the name of Tzans? So he came to Eretz and he called together a meeting of the Roshei HaKoel. And he said, all I'm asking for you is not to eat Chometz and Pesach and keep Shabbos. Is that too much to ask? He said, is that too much to ask? Please, keep Shabbos and don't eat Chometz and Pesach. You know, I'm not asking for anything more. So the closing Rebbe, if you don't hold the Rabbeinu time, you're a Mechalel Shabbos, Posel Eidus, if you don't keep Rabbeinu time. And if you eat Mishima, says, definitely.
But not,
So I hold 72 minutes.
So Manchester, the Kloisenberger would also make 72 look
I
good
think
also.
so, yeah. To him, 72 minutes was the magic number. But he wasn't Makel. And I was surprised when Rabbeinu showed me some sources, and the most interesting one is Rav Shmuel Be'im, the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that testifies that Rabbi Akiva Eiger held 72 minutes, and there were places in Hungary which they did a malacha after the Shkia. I don't think anybody today, not even Kloisenberg or Satmar Hasidim, would do a malacha after the Shkia. I hope not. I don't know. So the Mishnah Bruri, even regarding Tfilas Mincha, is the one that said the Shkia is heilig, the Shkia is holy, and you should. But I would be makel davening Mincha after the Shkia, or washing the Shalashudas after the Shkia, or even have Shlit'a if it's right after the Shkia. I would be makel, but only if it's very in the 13 and a half minutes, and definitely not later.
That's because there are some people, or Moshe included, that once they're Maya at the 13 and a half minutes, if either Rav, if the Machlekas is where to place at 13 and a half minutes, then the 13 and a half minutes shouldn't move.
That means it shouldn't be more or
It
less.
shouldn't
And that is against the biggest Moshe. The biggest Moshe comes up with a new idea, which is a spark of genius. And he says, whatever it is between the Shkia and Tzais Yechovim, we divide into 4 sections, and then we divide it Gimel Rivei of a fourth of that time. What?
Minchas Kohen says already.
It's in the Minchas Kohen?
The
Yeah.
idea that it changes to be the Ofik.
It's
72
about
is not
16,
close.
the Baal that Chama 16.
Which means that, but the Chiddush is, if we talk about Gimel Rivei Mil, it should be an objective time, and what does it have to do with Shoros Hayom? Why would it have to do with Shoros Hayom?
That's only in the Yom-hashchor, the Ofik Eretz Yisrael. That's what the Gemara is talking about, and then the rest of the world changes.
If we're talking about Eifek, then it makes sense that it shrinks because it goes down faster. It's here.
Yeah.
That the Mishpur seems to have accepted from the Goyim shall that effect. It certainly changes the fees.
So the Gimel Rivei Mil is only
Yom-hashchor, the equinox in Yerushalayim, in Eretz
in
Yisrael.
Eretz Yisrael. And does that fit in? Does
Yeah,
that make
Tzias
sense?
wise, that's the reality. The reality is that
the closer you go to the center of the world, the faster sunset, meaning darkness, from sunset to darkness, will become.
Twilight's quicker.
Okay.
If either would the Rav shrink, meaning you have 9 minutes, you have 6 minutes, you have 13 and a half minutes to have Mincha after Shkia. How is that long minutes? Have to tire.
Classic title.
The Reisep said it fine. Other ones the Reisep.
Hefsek Tara, you know, I never really determined it in exactly in minutes. And if it's a very short time after the school, we'll make it by Hefsek Tara.
But it's if either Rav Shtickle, if you could be Mumayad or you have to go, you have to disagree.
I think this approach makes a lot of sense.
It does. There's a lot of nafkaminas also.
I want to see it in the Minchas Kohen. The Minchas Kohen is a sefer which is not very well organized.